You're listening to Best Practices with Kenny Berger. On this podcast, we talk with the country's top trial lawyers about their approaches to every aspect of practice, from case selection to closing argument. Hello, and welcome to Best Practices with Kenny Berger, a podcast dedicated to educating and empowering trial lawyers across the country through interviews with many of our nation's best. I have a statewide practice here in South Carolina, and thanks to our amazing guests and listeners, we now have a nationwide podcast. That's pretty cool. And my hope is that by the end of this episode, you will be a better trial lawyer in person than you were when you first hit play, and that the lessons drawn from this interview will have a positive impact on your clients' lives. Lastly, and as always, a big thank you to my team for making my role in this podcast as simple as getting to walk in and learn from some truly great trial lawyers and experts. And with that said, our guest today is Dr. Dawn Sheehan. Dr. Sheehan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here today.
Yeah, and you and I have not met in person, but we've gotten to know each other pretty well through doing a settlement opportunity video together involving a case earlier this year. And for folks who aren't familiar with you and your background, will you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So I am a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist. I've worked for many, many years in the role of a forensic psychologist, doing evaluations and doing direct services, and also as a clinical psychologist working with just general population, also doing a lot of evaluations in regards to general population as well. These days, I've kind of transitioned out of the direct service forensic role and am concentrating on consulting work in the field of forensic psychology. But I do still have my private practice where I see individuals and also do some evaluations for the general population as well.
And for our lawyer audience, what that obviously means is Dr. Sheehan is not here to try to get business from you as a named or retained expert, but is a fantastic consultant, and a lot of the work that she does behind the scenes we've found can be game changing. And Dr. Sheehan, what we wanted to do with the podcast today was talk about clients who have experienced trauma, clients who may very well be experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, so that we can talk about ways that we as lawyers can best help these clients, can best assist them in terms of quality of life, and also be able to best understand what they've been through and what they're going through to present their damages in an accurate, truthful, and persuasive way. So kind of starting at the beginning, what should everybody, lawyers or otherwise, know about folks who are experiencing trauma and post-traumatic stress?
Yeah, there's a lot to know, right? And I think in your specific space, being personal injury attorneys, you deal with that every day. Most of your clients, if not all of your clients, they're coming to you having had experienced a traumatic incident or a series of events or incidents. That in and of itself is criterion A, right? The first criteria that anyone from a clinical standpoint is going to have to meet in order to, that's the very basis of trauma or PTSD. There's different stages of it as well. I think what I would say is really important for everyone, and even especially personal injury attorneys, to really grasp, is that prior to the emergence of a diagnosis or symptoms of PTSD, is you have that acute stage of trauma stress, right? So there's acute stress disorder, which is the precursor of post-traumatic stress disorder. And those are the symptoms that you see within the first month of somebody experiencing, witnessing, or being told about a traumatic event. So trauma doesn't just mean it can mean more than just that person who experienced it. The mom who got the phone call about her child being in a horrific accident, she was told that a close loved one, experienced this. That also qualifies as having experienced a traumatic event. So actually experiencing it individually, being told that somebody close to you has experienced a traumatic event, or witnessing a traumatic event, all qualify. But in those early stages, that first month, that person, those people are still in the acute stress state. It's not until several months after when somebody either continues to experience those symptoms or somehow develops them thereafter, where we really see the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms begin to arise. So I think from a clinical standpoint, I would say that anybody dealing with clients or people in general who have experienced a traumatic event is to understand that they're still in that acute stress stage. And the symptoms of that parallel PTSD, but they're in that acute stage.
And in terms of those symptoms, what are some of the maybe classic symptoms, but also some of the symptoms that people wouldn't consider just offhand, that again, as a clinician you've seen and treated, but for the average person, it may not be as apparent?
Yeah, that's a good question. So by definition, whether we're talking about acute stress or post-traumatic stress, within the titles themselves is the word stress. So inherently, you're going to see that kind of anxious presentation, or crying, or just a general sense of emotional distress. But what you can also begin to see is some depression or withdrawal, isolation, lack of concentration, inability to engage in daily activities in the way that they used to. One of the most profound symptoms that I think is important for personal injury attorneys and other attorneys, right? Even defense attorneys to understand. And I've had to make this argument as a forensic psychologist before, that one of the main criterion is that people will begin to avoid things, places, people, anything that reminds them of the traumatic event or their traumatic experience. That avoidance component is key. And by nature, we want to avoid things that are traumatic, right? Why? It seems kind of, counterintuitive to want to, to want to be reminded of them. So for instance, if I do an evaluation on a personal injury client who, that has experienced some type of traumatic event, a lot of times I'll hear from defense counsel, or, you'll see in, opposing counsel's independent evaluation that comes back, oh, they waited so long, right? Or they didn't seem to be very cooperative with getting information or showing up to the appointments. Could that be because they were avoiding? Yeah, I've even had a lot of private patients that I just see for therapy and counseling who are experiencing PTSD, and they've waited to start therapy. They've waited to seek counsel on the matter because of the fact that they're engaging in that avoidance response.
And that's so natural, I think, for if something is painful or uncomfortable. I mean, just in everyday life, people will think to themselves or say out loud, I don't want to talk about it. And I don't want to talk about it, a lot of times it's pretty mild feelings, right? You just don't want to deal with whatever it is it's on a relatively mild scale. But when someone's had their life threatened, nearly taken, witnessed something horrific, witnessed a death, had a child taken, a parent, whatever, I mean, that kicks, to me, at least in my mind, the I don't want to talk about it up to such a whole another level. And it almost feels like they're between that rock and a hard place. I mean, it's a Hobbesian dilemma. Either I talk about it and suffer, or I don't talk about it and suffer.
Correct. But that person who's experienced trauma and they're either in that acute stage of traumatic stress or the post-acute stage, it's not really a choice. Their brain is signaling to them, stay away. Whether it's talking about it, whether it's going back to the place where it was, whether it's driving along that same road, and we can talk about this a little bit. That trauma network, as the traumatic stress kind of builds, right, and it broadens and it deepens and becomes more profound, what we call the trauma network also broadens and deepens. Okay, this is where you'll see people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. They'll have a trauma response when they don't even know what triggered it. Okay, well, that might be because when the traumatic event happened, there was something else within your environment that you were sensing or perceiving that is completely unrelated, but now it's become part of that network. Okay. So when that car crash happened and there was a red car next to you, and now you find yourself having a panic attack on the road and you don't know why, because it's been 7 years, well, maybe there's a red car next to you. Okay. So things that aren't necessarily or seemingly unrelated become intricately connected and aligned with the initial traumatic event.
And we've got this in a case right now. In fact, we were supposed to have a deposition this morning, and it got postponed. We've got a client, her terrible crash on I-95. And this person lives down in Florida. And early on, they didn't want to be on I-95, right? They didn't want to be on I-95 in South Carolina. They didn't want to be on I-95, obviously, in Florida. And then speaking of network, the network unfortunately grew beyond that to they didn't want to be on any interstate or highway. Then it
Correct.
was they didn't want to be traveling in cars at high speed. And then it became they really just hated the idea of being in a car, let alone driving. So they started being a passenger more, and that didn't help. So then they started getting and using ride share more often. And then when they would go out and do anything, when they'd be at social events, and this person is a real estate agent and dealt with a lot of high-end people, and where networking was really everything, they'd be so stressed to the point of panic attacks to even leave their house to go to these events, to then when they got to the events, they didn't feel like themselves. They had a loss of confidence. They were thinking about how they were going to get home. They didn't want to be there. And they went from being someone who was a social butterfly to basically a hermit. And they didn't like it, right? They didn't enjoy what they had become. They didn't really enjoy who they had become. They saw how it was impacting their relationships. Then they beat themselves up for it, which only increased the anxiety. Mild depression set in. And it's just been a really, really vicious cycle for this human being. And fortunately, they've gotten help. And at the same time, the help hasn't cured them.
Right. And that is a textbook example of how trauma and resulting PTSD begins to become all encompassing. It bleeds into so many corners of your life. And that's where, from a clinical standpoint, right, when we're diagnosing anything, right, that functional impairment becomes very apparent. And it's cumulative in nature with PTSD, because as you were describing with your client, that trauma network really does broaden, right? If your client happens to have, they're reluctant to drive on I-95, and then they happen to be on I-95 and they have a panic attack, that's traumatic in nature in and of itself. I don't know if you've never had a panic attack, it feels like you're going to die. It is terrifying. And whatever is going on at that given point then becomes attached to that nuclear trauma to begin with. So now it becomes, maybe they were driving in the late afternoon. Well, I can't drive anywhere in the late afternoon now, right? It gets folded into the dough and really becomes entrenched in that. So if you could think of kind of like a spider web, like this network of things that gets attached, that's exactly what happens. And then, as you said, it begins to bleed into a lot of areas of their life. Their self-concept, how they feel about themselves, how they feel about others, the world in and of itself becomes a really scary place.
Yeah.
And they disengage.
So what can be done about that? What can both lawyers help clients achieve, and what type of care, counseling, or otherwise should we make sure our clients know are available that may be effective, again, if not in curing, at least in helping?
Yeah, I always encourage, especially personal injury attorneys to really have a strong network of clinicians in your community that you know of that specialize in at least trauma informed care, if not trauma itself, so that you have resources for your client to be able to sit down and talk. And yes, they may decline at first, right? Let's not forget about that avoidance component, but to really encourage that, to know where your client may be at in the moment, even if it's not readily apparent that they're experiencing some of these symptoms, to at least frame it from an informed standpoint of trauma, right? Trauma informed practice of knowing that even if it's not apparent, right? If it's not palpable at the time, that they're probably experiencing some of it. And even meeting them there and like saying to them, hey, look, I know this has got to be tough for you. I know when I ask you to write down a timeline of what happened that day, that's not going to be easy for you, and that you're going to want to probably avoid it because that's normal when you've experienced a traumatic event. That's not giving them permission to necessarily procrastinate in what you're requesting that they provide for you so that you can best kind of frame your case. But at least it validates that you understand that, hey, I know you might instinctually want to avoid that, but I really need you to push against that, right? And that's where perhaps if you had referred them to a good counselor or a clinician, you can say, hey, you might want to talk to so and so about this, right? They're not there to force you to do things, but they're there to help you develop and implement skills that might be able to help you get through it. And that if you're having a rough time with it, call them and have a session.
And to that end, I mean, are there some specific counseling techniques or modalities that you've seen used over your career that have proven effective with PTSD?
There's quite a few. There's the classic talking therapy, which is kind of encompasses all kinds of different modalities of treatment. But obviously cognitive behavioral treatment is a go-to. And then when we're talking about pretty severe PTSD, techniques such as EMDR are, scientifically based, and that they're fantastic when done properly to help clients kind of neutralize.
And Dr. Sheehan, EMDR involves eye movement.
Yes, yes. So EMDR is the rapid eye movement desensitization, and that's scientifically based. And I don't know if you're familiar with how that was even developed, but
Not.
there's a very famous neuropsychiatrist who studied trauma, things like that. And she was actually going through a really stressful time in her own life, and she decided to go out on a hike. And as she's, and if those of you who have been hiking, as you're hiking, you're tending to gaze from side to side of the trail that you're hiking on. And at the end of her hike, she felt much better. She, wasn't as stressed out. Her thoughts weren't ruminating over this stressful event. And she started to wonder if that had something to do with her eye movements. And then she began to research it. So that was kind of like the beginning of, how EMDR was developed. But it's a very scientifically based neuropsychological technique that, I think back in the day they were kind of like, oh, it seems hokey, but it's not. It's literally, working your brain in different areas to help build different networks and kind of like neutralize or ablate some of the negative ones.
Thank you. And Dr. Sheehan, kind of shifting gears to the second half of our talk on presenting these damages. And when I think about presenting these damages, what I'm really thinking is how to best help your audience understand the damages, how to best help your audience understand how it's led to loss of enjoyment of life or mental anguish or embarrassment. What have you seen in terms of effective ways to help, be it again the public, which obviously your jurors are drawn from, but to help them understand again what PTSD is and why someone can't just quote, get over it and move on with life.
Right, right. Well, I think that's tough, right? Because I think it's so difficult to explain to a layperson, right, or even a jury if they're not familiar with it. But I think a lot of people are familiar with trauma these days, right? I think there's so many, you hear so frequently, trauma informed care, trauma informed this. So I think on a general basis, the average person has a deeper appreciation for trauma, right? Um, but there's lots of different ways to, in I guess, inform your audience about the different aspects of trauma. Now you have if you're, fortunate enough to be able to have a neuropsychological or neuropsychiatric evaluation that can assess for that in objective ways, right? When we're talking about psychological testing and objective testing, that's a fantastic way. But you and I both know that those reports come back and they're really technical, right? And even when you put that expert on the stand, it's tough sometimes to get that expert to toggle between the technicalities of the diagnosis and the testing and all this other stuff and what it means, and then be able to equally and impress upon the jury or the audience, what does that mean from a practical standpoint? What's the human experience behind that?
Yeah, and to that end, on the human experience behind that, I'm not sure if either in your clinical practice or your former forensic practice, speaking with the trauma victims' family members or the people close to them who may be more willing to talk about the changes that they've seen in the plaintiff or in the client.
Yes, absolutely. Having family members, friends, employers talk about the changes that they've seen is really important, because that's an objective perspective as well. Now, Obviously, I know that it's tough because those individuals aren't necessarily neutral and objective, or not, they're not unbiased participants. But if the data all lines up, then that's where the overarching understanding comes in. So you got the psychological evaluation that says X, Y, and Z, and then you have that same expert talking about how that impacts the person practically, and then you have these other parties who are able to talk about their own observations. Those are all collateral informants that carries weight.
Yeah, and I think about like objective evidence, right? And you may have objective findings on psychological testing, but if mom used to cook dinner 3 or 4 times a week before, and now mom cooks dinner at best once a month, and it's just not the same, and she has a tough time really getting up for it and kind of putting herself into it. I mean, I'm big on, or if someone used to go to the gym 3 or 4 times a week, and now they go once every 2 months, and they've objectively gained 30 pounds, and they've objectively this and objectively that. I think whenever you can kind of look at those numbers to compare and contrast before and after, it just, to me, provides one more additional piece of evidence that can layer upon and is consistent with the clinical picture.
Absolutely. And another very, I guess, impressive piece of information, again, if that person is going through therapy, or they're going through physical therapy, getting statements or collateral information from those treatment providers can also be very impactful. One of the things I think we mentioned and talked about when we talked earlier was having, like, maybe even a blind expert to be put on the stand, where this is somebody, and I've certainly testified in this capacity, somebody who has an expertise in trauma, in PTSD thing, or whatever the case might be, and they're not, even though they're retained by you, they haven't evaluated any particular party or anything along those lines, and you're able to kind of present that information to them, and they're able to educate the judge and the jury about what PTSD is, or what they would suspect might be happening in this case, or what's likely to happen. PTSD and trauma is one of those really funny things where you can seemingly be in remission from it, right? And then it emerges again a year later.
I believe in psychodrama, and one of the things that really hit me, and we're careful when we do this with clients, and we're careful that they're in a position where they can go through the psychodrama. At times, if an expert in psychodrama is needed, where it's not us trying to play that role and do so at our client's detriment. But there's such a difference between telling the story and putting yourself right back in it with all your senses involved. And I mean, there were things I thought that I was over that happened 30 years ago, that if I told you the story, Dr. Sheehan, if I said, this is what happened, that happened, I'd move through it. I don't think there'd be a whole lot of physiological response on my part. But in like reenacting it and putting myself back in that space and hearing the telephone ring, right? And allowing myself to be right back there 30 some odd years ago. And for me, it was kind of the moment I knew my parents were like getting divorced because a bunch of just god awful, stuff was getting torn to hell. Again, talking about one thing, but going back and putting yourself in it when it's real again. Like you said, you may think you're totally past something, and then you're back in it, and you're like, "My God, huh?
Yeah,
I might
yeah. Well, what works, so why psychodrama works so well is that it doesn't allow for that same defense mechanism. Again, one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder could be dissociative type of symptoms. Now, dissociation exists on a continuum along any, as with any other symptom. It can be very, very mild or very severe where you're, completely dissociated. So,
And for the audience, we tell them what you mean by dissociation or dissociative.
Where you're disconnecting yourself from the event, like you're completely disconnected emotionally. This is where you find people getting on the stand, right? Victims of crime or people who have been injured or experienced some other type of trauma. They'll get on the stand to testify, and there's seemingly no emotion behind it, right? They're kind of like this blank slate, and they're not demonstrating or exhibiting the emotions that one would expect, and it kind of makes people scratch their head. But that in and of itself is a kind of like a form of dissociative defense mechanism where, yes, I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to talk about it very matter-of-factly, and the emotions that you would think go along with it aren't really going to be present. But the psychodrama circumvents that, right? Because you're literally kind of re-experiencing it. So yes, it is so effective. I agree with you. You got to be real cautious in doing that at times, right? But it's incredibly helpful.
Yeah, and Dr. Sheehan, you recently had the opportunity to see these things from a juror's perspective. And you got selected for a jury in a case where you thought there's no way they're ever going to put me on this jury, and they did. Will you tell us about some of the takeaways you had just as a juror in terms of observations, and you were an alternate, so you weren't there for deliberations, but just how you experienced a case as a juror?
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I think I even mentioned to you that there was a huge piece of me that didn't want to be selected. And, it was in a courtroom that I had testified before. The judge was familiar with me. I wasn't familiar with the attorneys because it was a criminal case, but they knew what I did for a living. And I was actually really surprised that I got selected. But at the same time, I was really, really interested in what that would be like because I've never been on that side of the bench. So it was incredibly interesting. And I think when we talked about this, how it was a criminal case that involved a stepfather who had horrifically abused, including sexually abused, his paramour's children. And these children testified on the stand, and it was heartbreaking. But at the same time, you kind of saw that defense mechanism come into play of a little bit of dissociation, and they weren't breaking down crying. You could see that they were a little anxious and nervous, of course. But what the prosecution did, which I thought was genius, they put on a blind expert who was an expert in sexual abuse of children and the resulting traumatic effect that has. This expert knew nothing about the case prior to taking the stand, was given zero information, which is pretty uncommon, right? It's a little bit of a risky proposition, but I can honestly say that and I've testified in that capacity as an expert, never as a blind expert, but as an expert. But I can say, even from my perspective, her testimony, this expert's testimony, was so compelling. And I just found it really fascinating to be on that side of the equation.
Yeah. Yeah, and that independent nature, right, I think goes so far with so many people. I mean, we talk about credibility as everything. Well, I think when it comes to credibility, the best way we can build it is by telling the truth and showing that, if there is any bias whatsoever, that bias is toward the truth. and toward a just outcome versus one specific side at the risk of one's own license and integrity. Dr. Sheehan, I had a question that I've read some on this, and you and I didn't talk about it in advance of the podcast, but the evidence out there on the long-term effects on someone's brain and nervous system from post-traumatic stress disorder. And we talked about kind of the trauma network and how that network expands almost like a spider web. How about when it comes to the way that the brain and the brain's networking and nervous system is impacted or damaged by long-term post-traumatic stress disorder?
There is a lot of research out there that the long-term damage may never resolve. Not just that, but you know, that famous book out there now, right? The Body Keeps Score. So it's not just the brain. It's also the effects that it has on the entire body, right? The central nervous system, your heart. We all know that increased cortisol over a long period of time and these neurochemicals that are released when we are in a state of trauma or stress, they're incredibly damaging and caustic to our health. That's what you see over the long period of time. Also, from a just a neuropsychological perspective, you know, they've shown that the brain structure does begin to change over a long period of time when it comes to post-traumatic stress. And that is not something that may ever be rectified. And it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of courage for people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder to continuously revisit these memories, these things that their brain and their every ounce of their body is telling them to just try to forget. But it's a maintenance issue too, right? We can't expect somebody who has gone through some of the things that they've gone through to just be able to get over it. And then there's some things that are kind of like there's a thing called complex trauma. So complex trauma, I think more commonly and textbook we hear about complex trauma with like childhood abuse that or abuse that has happened over and over an extended period of time. But that's not the only scenario where you're going to find complex trauma. You find complex trauma in medical trauma. Somebody gets horrifically injured and now they have to go through a series of surgeries followed by recovery, followed by physical therapy, and then there's another surgery. The medical trauma, and I talk a lot about medical trauma when I do consulting work with personal injury cases, is a very, very serious issue, right? So not only do you have the traumatic piece from the whatever initial incident might have occurred, but now you have this compounding trauma that continues along this trajectory of all the negative consequences that these individuals have to endure. And then you have protracted litigation, which can be traumatic in nature as well. So there's a lot. These individuals are really shouldering so much, and more gets piled on.
Yeah, I got a question, something we haven't talked about, but when the person or entity that caused the harm is doing one of two things that we see sadly every day, either saying I didn't do it, or it's not that bad. How does that kind of the denials by the wrongdoer or the one that inflicted the harm or trauma, what impact does that have on the person living with it?
That has a tremendous impact. And understandably, that's just part and parcel of what's going to happen when it comes down to litigation. However, with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's also that piece of blaming oneself. I've never worked with somebody who is dealing with trauma or PTSD that hasn't on some level blamed themselves, right? If I hadn't stopped for that cup of coffee, right? If I hadn't done that, if I had just only done that, uh, maybe I was asking for it. It this is it's part of the symptoms. So there's a piece of them that's blaming themselves already, and we do that because it's a way for our brain to kind of make sense of it, where there might have been some way for us to have control over something that really was never our fault. But as human beings, we try to make sense of things. And one of the ways that we do that is by looking at how we may have or could have prevented something, or how we may have caused something, and then compounding that with the denial or with trying to blame the other party. Yes, it reinforces that that tendency for people with trauma to already blame themselves.
It's sad. I mean, we see it all the time. Like you said, it's such a natural human response, in large part out of survival, to figure out how can we avoid something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and one particular case that comes to mind for me, that was a treatment case. I was actually treating this person clinically. Um, it was a wrongful death and personal injury case. It was a case of some younger, a couple of younger adults and one teenager, that a school bus pulled out in front of them, and they T-boned the school bus, and one of the younger individuals passed away at the scene of the accident. The other one was in a coma for a long period of time, and then the client that I was seeing, he also was in a coma, but recovered from that and had some very, very severe injuries. And the survivor guilt that this young man experienced was astronomical. It was unbelievable. And he suffered and struggled with that to an extent that I have no words for it. How terrible he felt about being the one that survived, and not just survived, but wasn't injured to the extent that he couldn't walk or talk or things like that. So the survivor guilt is a very real thing too.
And Dr. Sheehan, I mean, you're now working on in a consulting role, and also in collaboration with your husband, Nick Fieser, who's a tremendous filmmaker, and has been doing videos on our cases and other cases across the country. You've had exposure to now seeing, again, lots of different trauma caused by lots of different means, both clinically and forensically, as a retained expert, now in a consulting capacity. Is there anything kind of sitting here in 2024 in the current world that looking ahead, again, lawyers like myself should know about dealing with trauma victims, and trauma victims kind of in current modern society, and all of its unique challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, kind of trying your best. And obviously you're not a clinician. No one's ever going to be expecting you to be a clinician, but approaching your practice with a trauma informed eye, right? Or framing it from a trauma informed perspective. And I'd love to see more CLEs offered to attorneys from, clinicians such as myself, to just help with that. Again, not expecting you to know how to treat them, but just from a trauma informed standpoint.
If you want to do one, we can probably set one up with the South Carolina bar.
I would love to do that. I would be very, very interested in doing that. I used to do CLEs back in the day, but since moving to Pennsylvania, I haven't really done any, but yeah, I'd love to do that.
I won't
Um,
say we can make that happen, but I think we can facilitate that happening.
yeah, I think it
And I
would
think it
be
would be a benefit to, I mean, my big thing on CLEs is, let's make sure it's same with this podcast, right? Like, let's make it be a benefit to the attorneys and more importantly, to every human being they represent.
absolutely, yeah. And I would also, going back to what you were asking, kind of like looking forward from a consulting perspective, I think it's I think it's so important to have somebody that you can reach out to as a consultant. For instance, with Ashton's case, I there was very little that would have maybe provided you with the information of how that could affect him from an attachment standpoint. So if if you have right if you have a clinician that you've worked with in the past, or even a consulting psychologist such as myself that you can reach out to, it doesn't have to be some massive um, project that we do together, but just to bounce around ideas, right? It's important to get those different perspectives from the different clinicians and the different professionals of how that could really impact the damages piece of understanding. Like, for instance, with Ashton, moving forward, that attachment piece, I think for him is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, because now all of a sudden mama is the one that hurt him. She didn't hurt him, she helped him, but four family members holding all four of his limbs while mom scrubs his wounds. That's not something that you get over. Dr. Sheehan, for folks who want to get in touch with you in a consulting role, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can Google me, or I have a website specifically for my consulting. It's psycholegalconsulting.com, and you can go there and you can contact me through there.
Great. Dr. Sheehan, it has been an absolute pleasure being with you. We look forward now to doing a CLE in South Carolina. I think
I look forward to that. That would be
yeah,
amazing if we could do that and put that together for your audience.
I think we can. I think we definitely can. Dr. Sheehan, I can't thank you enough. I've enjoyed learning from you for quite a while now. I've enjoyed being with you today, and just thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone in our audience for listening to Best Practices with Kenny Berger. Again, our guest today has been Dr. Don Sheehan. If you found this episode to be of value, please subscribe, leave a review, and follow us on social media. It's your engagement that helps us reach more people and continue sharing the best practices that can help trial lawyers at all stages in their career continue to learn and improve. And as always, when it comes to life-changing injury and wrongful death cases here in South Carolina, I am here to help. Dr. Sheehan, thank you so very much for being with us. And for all our listeners, thank you for joining us. Take care.
It was my pleasure.